entering. Welcome to everyone who's joining us for the final portion of our PSI Merit Conference, The Power of Community, Building Inclusive Networks of Research and Support. It's been a really fruitful conversation that we've had over the course of the day in both our plenary sessions and in some of our small group sessions. I know many of you here. I'm Jonathan Sherbino. I'm the Assistant Dean for Merit. Before we begin our final and culminating plenary presentation, I think it's important that we continue to be thoughtful about where we're situated and located. Certainly here at McMaster, these are the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee in the area protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We reflected earlier today over what does this mean as we just set and establish questions and we speak of how to disseminate information, as we make priorities about what counts and what doesn't, as we think about who is part of our research and how we have incorporated communities into it. And I think specifically we need to continually reflect about our legacy, which is not positive. In fact, is very challenging in terms of how we've dealt and interacted with First Nations, and the aspirations for how high quality, integrative, equitable research support, networking and collaboration needs to be as we continue to engage with First Nations that have occupied and are the original owners and inheritors of this land. So let's take one final moment today to be thoughtful about what this means for us. That it's not just a reflection about the larger community, but it's also a reflection about how we are situated as academics, as leaders and as researchers. I want to also welcome the co-chair for the PSI Merit Conference, Dr. Debra Cook. In a moment, I'll ask Deborah to introduce herself, and she's going to speak on behalf of PSI and the work that they are doing supporting education, supporting research, and supporting the academic mission across Ontario. Dr. Cook.
Thank you, Jonathan. You, Samantha, and team have done all the legwork to prepare for this, I guess the third now of the PSI-sponsored forum. And thank you on behalf of everyone who's here and people who have come before to prior sessions. I'm chair of the Grants Committee of Physician Services Incorporated, which is an agency very interested in supporting work that is either educational or research oriented for the betterment of the patients, because we are all patients and citizens in Ontario. So I just had a very short slide presentation I'd like to share with you to increase awareness about this funding opportunity. Even though the word physician services is in the title, the value, indeed the imperative of interprofessional, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary work is understood. So I hope that this is of some interest to any of you who are interested in research yourselves. I will just take a moment to get oriented here. Are you able to see this screen?
We can see the gallery view.
And now?
Yeah, it's kind of the slide sort of view.
It should be.
It will work. We can see the slides, but not in presenter view.
Jonathan, you know what? I sent it to you and Samantha, if you want to pull it up. It should be in the full display mode here. I don't know why. So just let me know if I should keep going. So sorry, it looks slightly suboptimal, but PSI has been around a long time. It's Ontario based, and there are a lot of resources available for research and education to help to understand and improve the health of Ontarians. So it is an agency that has had a lot of impact in the early days, developed originally through advocates, physician advocates of improved healthcare in Ontario. And thanks, Jonathan. If you want to move on to the next slide. It is a registered charity, although it receives, sadly, no donations from physicians, ironically, but it supports an enormous amount of work. And the next slide goes over the possible, if you wouldn't mind then, Jonathan, if you're advancing the slides, the scope of what the remit is. And it is largely clinical, not so much translational or basic science research, but clinically relevant research that has the greatest opportunity of impacting on the health of Ontario as soon as possible. And that being said, the mission statement, I think, is really reflected in the opportunities. And the next slide identifies the different funding programs. What PSI is most probably known for is the operating grants, and there are three: traditional clinical research by physicians anywhere, medical education research, which is traditionally underprofiled, I might say, at PSI, and then more health services or health systems research. So new investigators are very welcome, and especially trainee or resident research. There's also salary support, which is very special for knowledge translation, this was really a place where PSI was ahead of its time to acknowledge the importance of disseminating information through various mechanisms now. There's in fact a knowledge translation PSI mid-career fellowship, mid-career being very important. As we all know, people in the middle of their career often are sort of in a gap space when it comes to career support and, of course, resident trainees. Very importantly, because so much care is delivered in the so-called community, even though community hospitals, community centers are blurring in terms of the boundaries between those venues for practice and academic centers, there is special opportunities for healthcare research by community physicians and additional, shall we say, refreshments or sabbatical training opportunities for people working communities who may want to bring back, let's say, a special surgical technique to their community or advanced training on melanoma screening, for example. The next slide shows some of the details of the health research opportunities. Remember the three different scopes. So physicians who are leads of the study are welcome to apply, or a clinical fellow in training. And the duration of support is up to 3 years, although it can be reduced to 2 years. So again, the three foci: clinical research, medical education, health systems. The next slide goes over the new investigator. So understanding the vulnerability of new investigators trying to embark upon the advancement of science. It is also similar, great amount of funding, and the situational imperative, understanding who the mentor is of the individual trying to lead the research is reflected in the need for mentor support and departmental support. The next slide goes into the trainees. So we know early exposure to almost anything in life can have a positive or negative effect on our lives and within our profession, so is the case. So exposure to research opportunities through PSI is involved here with up to $30,000 grant to advance a trainee-led program. And this is not meant to be a resident project, which is really a disguise for the senior investigator project. So it's really meant to authentically offer the opportunity, again, Ontario-based, and the role of the resident needs to be specified. So it's authentic in that way. The next slide shows that, ironically, unusually, I would say, there is no deadline to apply to PSI for funding. So we took this approach because we realized, even though many of us work to deadlines in our lives, ideas for research and creativity and the imperative to ask questions doesn't necessarily come in a deadline. So this is how we've enabled the PSI to carry forward with funding, no particular deadline. And we've got some good news about how quickly we get back to you with results. And the next slide shows some of these data. So we have, because Ontario is a populous province in Canada, has many different physicians and scholars who know a lot about the topics. We found it helpful to go outside of Ontario, and you can see that Canada Canadian investigators and peer reviews comprise about half of the peer reviewers, but we do get a lot of expert reviews from the US, of course, international, but other international as well. Next slide. Thank you. Goes over the time to decision. So this is relatively short. Some of you will be familiar with the traditional national agencies. So the median is about 4.5 months, 20% almost of the proposals submitted. We get back to people within 3 months, and almost always within 6 months. That's been challenged over the pandemic, where many people have not had the latitude to do peer reviews, but we try to get back to people as quickly as possible. And the next slide shows another special feature, which is knowledge translation specific. It's a fellowship for those trying to promote and pursue knowledge translation in any particular format for the advancement of health of Ontarians. So again, a substantial award, largely focused on relatively new investigators. The next slide goes over additional career support, the fragility of the person in a mid-career status. Again, physicians with a very clear focus for their clinical as well as academic activity. The opportunity here. And next, the trainee. So these opportunities are open to everybody interested, and I find they're not as well advertised or disseminated as they could be. So I hope some of you will consider these opportunities and apply. So coming toward the end there on the next slide, again, no deadline whatsoever. You'll find extremely responsive staff. I think Jonathan and I have really appreciated working with PSI on these kinds of events, and Jonathan, Samantha, and team have been incredible at organizing them and disseminating their availability and even archiving them, as I found out. The next slide shows that we are very happy to transparently report the success rate, which is rather unusual in a lot of agencies because it's provincial, and because we keep clear metrics and document success rate. I think this is helpful. Journals more and more are doing this, as we know, but I hope people may avail themselves of these opportunities. And next. The amount of money has been about $140 million over recent years, shared over time. In 2021 alone, $5 million of support for individuals in pursuit of scholarship and studies. The next slide. There's two sort of steps. It's obvious, writing a protocol, submitting it, but afterwards there's a local account set up and some reporting that is necessary. And then what we do try to do is disseminate the stories generated through these research projects in social media and through other PSI promoted activities so that others can learn and hopefully be inspired.
But it is my great pleasure to introduce our closing panel. We've had an opportunity to hear ideas and to be challenged. We've had an opportunity to meet in small groups and discuss and continue that conversation. And now we're going into an intermediate type of presentation where we're going to have leaders and academics and researchers in the field engage with one another around what are the implications? How do we actually translate that into practice? And the way that this is set out is I have a number of questions. I'm going to facilitate a conversation amongst our panelists, but I'd also invite you, and I'll monitor the chat, to raise themes or ideas, to probe and ask questions, and try to get what does it mean for us as a FHS community? What does it mean for us as members of the larger health professions education community and the education research community? What are the steps that we need to start to consider as we move from today into tomorrow? It's my great pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Karen Hauer, one of our keynote speakers from earlier in the day. For those of you who are not in attendance at our session, Dr. Hauer is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she's also the Associate Dean for Competency Assessment and Professional Standards. As I have indicated before, I'm immensely interested, if not highly jealous, of her proclivity as an education researcher. Her stuff is fantastic. If you're not aware of it, I would direct you to much of her work, which she shared earlier, but also it extends beyond that in the areas of competency-based medical education, learner assessment, equity and assessment, coaching and remediation. In addition, she's held a number of national leadership positions, including her work at the National Board of Medical Examiners, as the deputy editor of medical education, the Journal, and as the past president of the clerkship directors in internal medicine. It is also my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cathy Ridson, who will be familiar to many of us. Cathy is the inaugural holder of the David Braley Nancy Gordon Chair in Family Medicine. She's a professor of family medicine and is the current chair of the Department of Family Medicine. She has quite a legacy here within our medical school, most notably, amongst many other things, as the co-creator of the professional competency curriculum. She also holds a doctorate of management and organizational change. We just discovered today that Alexandra Trottier, who is the director for the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge, is unable to join us. She's okay, but is having some issues that prevents her from being with us today. So with that, and I'll begin with a thank you to both of you for being here and a part of this. The first question, I guess, or the first theme I want to explore is, and you can answer it in a number of ways, is this idea of an academic network, or you can use the term team if that's a smaller bite to kind of approach. Can you talk about a successful one that you have been a part of or have designed it? And what's the measure of success for you? How is that successful? How is it supportive? How did you intentionally start to craft it? Or what were the features of it if it was a network or a team that you joined?
I guess I can go first. Great question. And thank you for including me in this discussion. I will speak about a mentee, Justin Bullock, that I met when he was a medical student looking for a project to do during his master's year. And he agreed to take on developing a survey about clerkship grading. And I think what I've enjoyed about the network that we've built together is that it's been mutually reinforcing. And I think that bidirectional aspect has been great. I've looked for ways to connect him with leadership opportunities as well as research opportunities, and he's really taken those by storm. But then I started noticing that he was doing things like sponsorship of me, which was pretty cool. And I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, I was doing that. And that was really nice to see. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can use these skills in ways that flatten the hierarchy for sure, and sort of push both people forward. He's now pursuing a PhD, so that's expanded my network, getting to work with the people that he's engaged to populate his doctoral team. And I've been able to connect him with colleagues to take our research questions beyond our own institution and really think about what's transferable or generalizable. So I think that it's not something we do for people or impart on people, but rather a way of working that hopefully is happening across the network.
Before I let Cathy jump in, I just want to follow up there, Karen. So I'm hearing in your description that these are organic in nature and less intentional in the onset. Is that kind of been your experience, or have there been there been other examples of academic networks that have been helpful for you to lead or to be a member of that are more formalized?
I would say in terms of the organic aspect, when you're thinking about, today's focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, to just be alert to what's happening, who's at the table, who's not at the table, so that the things that are organic, you can steer in the direction that you think they need to go. In terms of more formalized things, I would say, first of all, I've become much more intentional about trying to think, who can I invite to a research team or point to another opportunity that isn't one of the people that I usually think of first, who might have lived experience, knowledge, skills, perspective that we haven't included before. And as I spoke about this morning, that's been enormously successful. And people have surprised me with the experience they bring. So maybe they've been interviewing patients and they can take that skill to develop qualitative research method expertise, that type of thing. A formal network that I've been involved in that has been great is the International Competency-Based Medical Educators, or ICBME. They've been growing and thinking about how to expand opportunities further, but it's really valuable there to see what are theories, methods, problems beyond the way that we look at them at my own institution or in my own state or country, because that group is international and people are working on competency-based medical education from the medical perspective, from the other health professions perspective, and from UME, GME, and PGME and CME. So that is a formal network that I found to be very rewarding and helpful.
Thanks. Cathy, what's your take? Have you been a part of a successful network or team that stands out for you, and if so, how do you measure that success?
What a great juicy question. And I'm already feeling a bit cheated. I didn't get to hear more of what you had to share earlier today, Karen. That question is just taking me in so many directions. So maybe I'll try to pull down a few. Totally agree with the organic nature of forming teams that lead to some generativity, be that a research project, some encouragement to try something new, a new curriculum. A lot of my emergent networks over my career have been about trying to change curriculum or open up different educational spaces. But I have to shout out to Dr. Debra Cook, who is my attending when I did my residency in internal medicine. And, I was not a family medicine career researcher, but we found some common ground after sharing our rounds, and we wrote a couple of papers together. So she modeled for me that seize the moment possibilities that I think any form of academic career offers over and over and over. And sometimes it's just about either claiming a person or giving them encouragement to rise to an opportunity. I think teams start to form. And I love Karen's description of the way Karen, you spotted some people that you started to claim and then things grew. I'll mention two things. Many of you have probably done a stepping stone exercise where you take a step back and think, okay, from where I am today, what might be 5 sentinel moments along my life path that got me to where I am today? And inevitably, there are people surrounding each of the stepping stones that made a huge difference. And those moments are sort of ripe for the taking practically every day of our career. So it really is about noticing what's going on around to see who can be claimed, who can be included, who might want to go for coffee and say, that was so interesting. Do you want to try working on something together? I don't even know what it might be, but it just seems we have something in common we might want to explore. So it's opening possibilities, I think, many, many times leads to something more that you don't know in advance, but it just feels worth taking a next step. The last network I want to highlight has been incredibly powerful in my career is the Academy of Communications and Healthcare it's largely based in the US, although it does have international tendrils. And it taught me facilitation skills and communication skills training. And I highly recommend finding a community that does some form of training together where you're with other folks who come from different careers and settings, but who you are learning alongside. As I've moved through my professional career, being with a disparate group of folks learning alongside me has been an amazing way to build relationships. And networks have been generative from those kinds of experiences in many directions. So it's almost like a purposeful adjacency that's not about local. It's not about building my local team, but putting myself in a situation of discovery with folks I would not meet for any other reason. I think that's been incredibly generative as well.
Both of you have kind of alluded to moments early in your career and mid-career. You're both very successful and established in senior positions in academia right now. Would you have insight into the different types of networks that you've needed along the way? I can't imagine that any academic trajectory has been perfectly straight from A to B. Not only has there been milestones, I suspect that there's been millstones or speed bumps along the way. Can you speak to the different types of networks and how they've served you at different points in your career as you face different opportunities or challenges, and however you want to address that idea of progression?
I started out early in my career as the internal medicine clerkship director, and that was a transformative organization for me to belong to, the clerkship directors in internal medicine, because it got me out of my own institution. And I felt within the institution, meeting with the other clerkship directors was similarly helpful to see beyond my own department. You know, where I trained as a resident, you rotate every month, but then once you get on faculty, you're at your same site all the time. And that can really narrow your view and the problems that you hear about and the perspectives that you hear people bringing. So I found that I was really looking for those ways to connect with people outside my department because the siloed view is definitely the narrow view. I also directed and was part of the California Consortium for the Assessment of Clinical Competence, which is the teams from each school that put on a standardized patient exam, an OSCE, every year. And that was also a very useful network for aligning around a similar role at each institution and presenting scholarly opportunities. So I would say for me, looking for those networks outside my home base has been critical since I've spent my whole career at the same institution. And I really like newness, even though I haven't moved around. So I think there are other ways to find it and seek it. And it's incredibly informative and rewarding.
I would definitely echo that, Karen. I find the mixture of the external work I do right now is a mixture of what feels like somewhat intensely bureaucratic and highly constrained kinds of work. And to be very honest, you know, that's part of academic medicine, as part of medical administration. There's a lot of structures with that move slowly with great deliberation and a fair degree of rules and structures. So as I move through those and have whatever influence I can, I will often find myself reaching out to folks equally immersed in the movement to have informal conversations, not about advancing an agenda, but trying to make sense of what's going on, trying to gain perhaps a bit of sanity about what feels like a very either opaque or highly politicized process, and getting someone else's take on an experience we might have shared that was, you know, bureaucratic or frustrating is actually very enlivening, and I think makes me more effective within the more constrained experiences. So I personally find it really helpful to invite another round of sense making with people I trust to share an experience that, you know, that I trust that I've shared an experience with, and that can happen informally. I can think of 3 or 4 projects I'm involved with multi-stakeholders, and I have a different group of people for each of those that I might do a bit of sense making for the best part of the world. It's not, there's the odd bit of ranting and venting, but it is actually more what do we think's going on here, and what might be an opportunity to work together to move something forward. So having another turn of the wheel in terms of an experience, I think is a really easy and effective way to build a supportive network, even for me in the roles that I carry. And as Karen said, finding someone internally who I either take along to those things, or if I'm working internally on sort of more local projects, one of the mentorship strategies I found effective is to invite those same conversations with colleagues with less experience. Again, their take is often very refreshing and brings sort of viewpoint diversity that's really helpful to me. And in sharing an experience and doing a bit of debriefing it, sometimes I can give them insights that are helpful in the other direction. So I'm a fan of, again, just taking a shared experience and trying to extract a bit more learning or reflection from it as a networking strategy.
Cathy, I was hoping maybe I could have you dig in a little bit on a theme that came up there, and you alluded to it with shared experience, with reflection, but you spoke of a network or a team that's built through trust. Do you want to unpack that idea a little bit more, measures by how you do that, why it's essential for the teams that you're describing?
Well, I think we know there's every bit of literature from, education alliances to any form of change process. People need to feel some sense of connection and belonging to take the risk for change to happen. So, having a basis of trust is in some ways an ongoing commitment I think anyone needs to make if they also want to learn or change. So I think you're probably pointing to some strategies we use to explore and create and build trust with one another. I mean, we could obviously talk at length about that. I personally find a bit of self-disclosure always helps, and self-disclosure in the service of understanding more of what the shared experience is. So, I might express surprise or doubt or frustration to a junior colleague with an invitation to understand what they might have experienced. So open up a bit of emotional territory, I think is important, gets to trust faster, and then really have a lot of curiosity and an openness to the other person's experience, and demonstrate that in that cycle, I myself am being changed. I am learning something and my viewpoint is changing as well. So taking each other seriously and seeing that movement of thought and change in viewpoint in both directions, I think is a very effective trust building maneuver as well. And then you get a bit, you risk more as you see that build between people and then as well on the team.
Karen, I think you wanted to say something. I cut you off by accident there. Apologies.
Oh, no problem. I really like Cathy's point about reaching out to people who you think will give you something different than what you're already thinking, like the example of someone who's younger or earlier in their training. I was recently at a retreat where the speaker had us each quietly write down 10 people that we would go to if we had a need for advice about something related to our work. And then the retreat leader made us feel better because she said that when she does this with lawyers, they never have more than 3 people that they can think of, but we were all able to think of closer to 10. And then she had us look at the list and think about how diverse the board of directors was, the personal board of directors, and asked us to reflect on whether we were seeking advice that would reinforce what we were already thinking, or if we were really getting new information based on the composition of this group that we had listed. So I think that's an exercise that I would recommend to someone or think about doing for myself, even more specifically related to the different parts of my job.
Karen, that's a really lovely segue for the next theme I wanted to explore for both of you. I'm optimistic, so I hope this is true, but I would like to imagine that our networks are starting to improve in terms of diversity. Historically, they perhaps have not, well, historically they've not been representing the groups that need to be represented in medicine. Can you speak to strategies about how you try to influence a more cohesive integration or a more equitable representation in the networks that you have been a part of, or the networks that you are building or supporting or leading?
Karen, you want me to have a crack at it first? Are you formulating thoughts?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a great question. It's such an urgent question right now. I have definitely felt the most comfortable as I've moved through a variety of projects in my career. I've actually always felt more comfortable seeking partners who had baked in viewpoint diversity based on age or discipline or training. You know, the first sort of formal curriculum I created in the medical school had a mandate to have 2 facilitators, you know, one who was a physician and one from a completely different discipline, to start to reap the benefits of viewpoint diversity. So that commitment has felt the most foundational one as I've built teams. So who here brings different experience, thinks differently, and is not, you know, not part of there's not a majority discourse that needs to be claimed in order to belong to this project. So that always has felt way more life-giving and enjoyable and creative to me. And I'll confess that, you know, the last several years have taught me a lot more about representation and folks who do bring the same degree of viewpoint diversity and an additional layer of life experience that I was not as intentional about in the early parts of my career. So, you know, I'm sure all of us are now taking another very serious look at the diversity of life experience that needs to be warmly and assertively welcomed and claimed into all of our planning tables and all of the spaces of creativity. And the questions and projects need to come from people who traditionally haven't had that choice. So I'm actually loving the more recent invitation for viewpoint diversity, because I think we're adding an extremely important and generative, life-giving dimension by you know, setting a wider table and inviting a greater degree of questioning. But for me, viewpoint diversity has just been at the core of any project I've tried to do.
I would agree, and I think my definition, my understanding of what that viewpoint diversity entails has expanded and probably needs to expand more. So I think that was really well said. And I would add, you also have to be ready to hear what people have to say and really use that information. Like, you know, we say that our students may not want constructive feedback, but I think we as faculty don't either. You know, wouldn't it be nice if you had a first draft of a proposal and everybody said, perfect, you know, you're done, but that never happens. And I think the more diverse voices you invite to contribute, the more they will have to say. And then the next step is, well, how do I use this information? How do we revise this or change our plan or shift gears if needed to not just hear what people have to say, but actually incorporate it. So sometimes that requires that you really have to pivot in how you're approaching something.
One of the, I guess, logistical or operational challenges is actually ensuring that your network, your team does have that broad representation, does have that mix of voices, and that the groups that are underrepresented in healthcare are appropriately represented in these networks. The challenge, of course, is that those who are underrepresented are facing structural barriers and structural bias. and may find themselves just confronting all of the additional work and challenges of that in and of itself. And simultaneously, we'll be very readily in wanting to engage in changing the system, but finding the dual challenge of both confronting and being called upon because they are in a position where there's an invitation to help be a part of a solution. And it's almost a taxing of that individual. So how do you build a team that has a diversity of perspective and that's rich in representation, without at the same time inviting the same people over and over and burdening those individuals with this additional responsibility and weight? How do we make sure that we have teams that are diverse without turning to the obvious people that we might always connect with? Solutions, experiences in addressing that challenge.
Well, one I can share is in one of the small groups today, we talked about the work of reviewing the curriculum to find places where representation was missing or patient portrayals were harmful or biased or not inclusive. So that's a ton of work. Everybody would agree. And I think a lot of medical schools are looking to do that. So at our institution, we created some training materials, but then we actually created a faculty position and elevated that review work into leadership roles that a panel of faculty have taken on, and designed the role so that it's not just grunt work, but that they're getting training and they have a method and they are seen as leaders alongside course directors. So I think that would be an example of a structural solution to the problem of taxing people who are already busy and disproportionately burdening some and not others without rewards. So this method is trying to build in the reward of time, through compensation and also training and status. Another thing that I think we're still trying to figure out, and maybe Cathy or others have ideas, is there's always the comment, did you get feedback? Did we have the chance to give feedback? How did you incorporate the feedback? So trying to be strategic about the right time and way to ask people, like, putting out a survey to the entire population every time you're going to do something would certainly give everyone the chance to respond, but it would probably be more feedback than you can reasonably use at one point in time. And it's hard for any individual to see where their feedback made a difference. So we've been talking a lot with our students and with our faculty and about community input, like what's the right way to ask a panel of individuals, hear a group of different voices without overburdening anyone or putting people to the work of giving feedback that isn't going to be used. So I think there is some strategy around the timing and who and how that can help with this issue of making sure that the feedback or the input that you collect can be meaningfully used and that you can report back how you used it.
That's I really like that that structural strategy. Making notes of some ways we might want to try that with some of our projects. I would add maybe a couple other observations about trying to do that strategically. My doctoral supervisor always said, and it was completely maddening at first, but I understood the wisdom of it over time, was let the question be your guide. And I'm sure that's a familiar saying to a lot of researchers as well. So we've been trying to generate, that starting point of resource allocation, time, attention, staffing, and so on, to questions that are coming from places that haven't normally been able to set things in motion. So when we sort of know we have the question right, and a recent example was about a method we used in our residency selection process that really put put on the table for folks who wanted to come to our residency program some questions that discerned their readiness to really take EDI and anti-racism, anti-oppression seriously in the course of their residency training. So the need for that question to be part of our selection process came from some of the younger residents and staff in our department who were also racialized. And they guided the work of the faculty in making sure that question ended up being very meaningful. So that would not be the more traditional thing might have been that senior faculty identified an issue and then sought input. So by having the impetus reflect a priority, I think it took advantage of the experience of people who, as you say, are always vulnerable to that kind of taxing. Another strategy that's been successful in university settings, I don't know, Karen, what your experience is. Sometimes the contributions of paid staff are valued differently than contributions of tenured faculty. And I can think of in our own setting, we are leveraging incredible expertise that staff are bringing to transform faculty thinking as well, or to have partnerships where the hierarchy that sometimes has existed between staff and faculty are really diminished, and faculty don't have as much time to be doing the networking, the sort of personal influence. But the faculty staff dyad we have in our department means there's one person whose full-time job it is to form relationships and help look for opportunities to leverage life experience that hasn't been well represented. And in concert with a faculty partner, we are just making great strides. So I think it's starting to expand our understanding of who needs to bring experience and influence into spaces where decisions are being made about resource. And we've had some real strategic benefit from thinking that way as well.
I want to transition us to maybe our last theme, and then I'll give you an opportunity to make some comments about where we should go and some final, I'll give you the last word on everything that you want to say. The last theme is we can have diverse team, or we can have a diverse network, but we might not have equity within that network. Can you talk to us about your experiences where you saw it managed well, the issues of power within a network or within a team, and best practices that we should be thoughtful of?
Well, I can start with this. It is there's asymmetries built into every team any of us will ever be on, and there are a whole bunch of variables that will contribute to those asymmetries. And I think a central question is, do those asymmetries negate or shut down or cause damage to a shared good, or are they also just an expression of forms of difference? So, I think in the setting I work in most, there's definitely asymmetries based on age and experience. There are folks with lived experience and equity deserving groups who probably have additional layers of being excluded in a lot of places. So intentionally, making sure conversations start with our most, if we're having a meeting that we ask the more junior or the less experienced folks to speak in first, or the seniors make a point of not setting the direction too soon, that we see if things emerge from the larger group without our voices being dominant. I think there's lots of opportunity in meeting practices and noticing who gets airtime and who doesn't. That's really, really important. Obviously paying people for their time no matter what, and not expecting expertise based on lived experience to be volunteer, and and really creating a resource for that to happen, I think is extremely important. I think there are differences in how humans see and understand the world that sometimes get ascribed to power that may not be. So I think a team that really values viewpoint diversity and really values different voices needs to also really value conflict and understand that conflict is an engine of learning and growth. And so having a curious and growth-oriented mindset, I think, is really, really important to have conflict be an engine as opposed to a stifler. And sometimes there's some skills required to be comfortable with that kind of environment. And so we're investing right now in sort of the skills in managing difference for our team members, so that folks don't flee when something happens that feels unfamiliar or potentially conflictual. So those are some strategies we're trying. And I think it's a living organic phenomena that you almost need to attend to for every team you're on, and for the different ways it gets expressed on the different teams. But I'd love to hear what Karen has to say about this as well.
Well, I'll start by building on your comments about, just structuring into the way that we have conversations at a team meeting or on a committee, with the junior person speaking first. On our curriculum committees where we don't do that, it's always at the last 2 minutes someone remembers, we should ask the student what they thought, and that really feels backwards. We have changed on our search committees how we gather committee input right after the interview. It used to be, you interview the candidate and then the candidate leaves, everybody has a conversation. Now what we do is the candidate leaves and everybody on the committee enters their comments into Poll Everywhere, and it's shown on the screen. So you've really given equal voice to everyone in the room, instead of having a couple of people dominate and then sway the discussion. So I think there are ways to literally bring in all the voices. A second thing I would say is having a conversation about just what Jonathan asked, and those require skill to lead those conversations and actually draw people out. But how is this team working for you? What feels equitable about our work? What would people suggest we need to change about our work? The first time I saw that done really well was a psychiatrist who was a committee chair, and people actually had a lot to say about how the committee was running. So I think your communications training from the academy would lend itself to that kind of conversation. I think that helps in the moment and also models the openness to hear more about what's working or not working from any perspective, or certainly from an equity perspective. The third thing I was thinking about is around authorship and academic credit. I think it's easy sometimes, just like when you're clinically supervising someone, to think it would just be easier if I did it myself, or it would be faster if I did it myself. I know how I like to do these things, but really taking the time to support someone to be the one who does the presentation or the one who's the first author, committing to that is just so important, and it brings a lot of reward. And then the next time that person has that much more experience and skill to bring to the table. So that's just a critical investment. And, the more senior people don't need the academic credit nearly as much as someone else could benefit from that opportunity. And then the last thing I'll say is your question did remind me that equity is a really important word. It's also a really commonly used word. And sometimes we hear from people that this is an equity issue when maybe equity isn't really what the issue is with that particular concern that they have. So sometimes when you hear equity, trying to understand more what someone's speaking about can take you to a different set of solutions.
Dr. Cook, do you want to pose your question, or you prefer for me to read it? Dr. Cook has, I see her coming back on camera. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I just enjoyed the session so much. Cathy, Karen, thank you. And Jonathan, great probing questions. I was just thinking about some of the comments you both made about conversation, the importance of words and dialogue, and just I'm always struck how with so many different ways to connect with people electronically, like there's the whole sort of culture and norms and patterns of email and text and the conversation, and now the Zoom world. And I remember doing a study years ago on email ethnography when that was very novel, and how it favored those who could, type quickly and express themselves eloquently or clearly and efficiently. And all the different ways in which people can connect can favor or disfavor individuals based on their comfort or proclivity or whatever, ability to express. And some folks are more interested in communicating when they're directly asked about things, and the notion of elicitation versus just wait to see what people think. Anyway, just wondered if you had some thoughts on that, because I really find myself working with more intentionality to consider the comfort and propensity for individuals to engage based on the vehicle and the directness with which their views are being sought, shall we say.
Yeah, I think you can plan things in a way that really help with that challenge. I mentioned this morning that the trainees that I asked about inclusive research networks, they all wrote about agendas, and they wrote about, sending the agenda in advance, sending the materials in advance. And I think that points out that, maybe I could show up to a meeting and just think on the fly what I would like to say about this project, or maybe I have a bigger bank of experience to draw on, whereas they want to plan a little bit and be prepared for what's going to be spoken about. So that gives them a better chance to contribute. Another strategy that I think can work well in a clinical teaching setting or in a conference committee type setting is to say in advance who you're hoping will speak up about something. Like, we're now going to discuss the duty hours report, and we're really hoping after this report to hear from some of the trainees first about their reactions. So you're giving them time within the session to plan their comments, and you're not just going to call on them when they weren't prepared. So I think some of those basic strategies really help. And then, like I mentioned earlier, making multiple ways that you can comment, like let's do a Zoom poll, let's all put something in the chat. You listed some great ones actually in your question, Deborah. So thinking that there are more than one way to communicate, and different people might gravitate toward one or the other. Mm-hmm. And respecting that someone might not have anything to say. That's perfectly fine too.
I forget about that last one often. And then that probably creates pressure. I appreciate that. And I'm wondering if I could just follow up briefly, just the notion of the structure and the agenda. The other thing I've tried, but I don't try it all the time because you have to know your audience, as the saying goes. But sometimes the structure, I find, almost inhibits the conversation, but other times it's really highly desirable to encourage people to come, especially if it's sent out in advance, and it makes people feel like it's going to, things are going to roll in an organized way. And sometimes the sort of less structured seems more invitational, but it's almost like I'm thinking about what works here.
I think that last part definitely depends on the context. Like if this is a research meeting, maybe we need to move the project forward. If this is a debrief about something that just happened, you could send out in advance, so this is going to be an open discussion, or something. But that type of setting probably wouldn't benefit from a very structured agenda, because that could inhibit the open sharing of ideas.
Yeah, I guess it depends who's there on the research team. Yeah. Because even within a research team, you know, there's people who always speak and people who are less likely to. I appreciate that.
I love the question because the verbally confident, it really does describe normal discourse in a lot of our spaces. I've been really tracking lately how many conversations, and I would say, you know, physicians are often guilty of this, and I'm not trying to stereotype, but the conversation pattern of asking a question, and it can be a great open-ended question. What do people think about the duty hours report? So you can ask an open-ended question. So often the responses are, they're actually fairly, they often point to a solution. They're often quite categorical. They'd be in the category of advocacy. And it is astonishingly rare for then the next thing to be an open-ended question. Wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Can you tell me more about your thinking there? So much more frequently, someone else will then speak into the original invitation with just a different point. So building a bit of a dialogical shared inquiry in meetings really can change the flavor and tone of what gets included and paid attention to. And it's often very efficient when someone states something very categorical to say, you know, to ask that probing open-ended question, because so often it's, you know, the difference that comes when everyone hears a word differently even, or we're not talking about the same thing at all, but we're all continuing to share our beliefs and our stance in regard to the thing we think we're talking about. So I do think, and, you know, there are some, again, depending on the meeting, but, you know, I don't normally bring a talking stick to my executive meetings, but a bit of a structured circle approach that, you know, everyone can be then invited and, you know, pass if you need to, or as a chair, really trying to open up dialogic space and open-ended questions and deepening my understanding of someone's perspective before someone then just shares their own. I find that can be helpful too.
Let's maybe transition to speaking of words, last words, which would be, what are the last words that either of you have for us? If there was a central point or points, if there was a call to action or actions, if there's a challenge that you would like to direct us to as we start to think about how do we build these networks? How do we build networks that are inclusive? How do we support groups that are underrepresented in healthcare? How do we support each other? Takeaway points from either of you.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind when I'm even thinking about networks I've accessed in the last 6 months is if I'm feeling stuck on anything, or I notice I'm ruminating, it's my signal to reach out to someone to start talking it through, to get the movement of my thinking away from a fixed place. And it's, again, we talked about how to being intentional about who you might reach out to, who I might reach out to recognize a resource that is inevitably going to help me, and maybe reside in a person who wouldn't in a million years think they'd be getting a call from me to ask for help. So dialogue itself moves thought and creates networks. And so I have found it so helpful and far less lonely to be in a leadership position by knowing at any given moment when I'm stuck, I don't have to call my senior mentor who's had 10 more years experience than me. I can actually call one of my junior faculty and say, what would your take on this be? And there's often a viewpoint or a way of thinking that I would not have considered. And that strengthens my relationship. It gives us another bit of social capital that we share that we might draw upon for a future project. And it usually gets me moving out of a stuck point. Now, obviously, there are things I can't do that about, but I think opening a new way of thinking alongside someone else and asking for help is a really, really effective way to jumpstart a team or a network that you just never know where that might lead. So that'd be one thing I would encourage people considering as a gesture of network building in their own spaces.
Building on that, Cathy, one thing that I started during the pandemic was doing a monthly call with someone that I consider a good friend, but who is a work friend that is in another institution at a similar position to mine. And we have really shifted those to be like a professional support / consultation. And it really helps. We each try to bring an issue to every call, and it really helps rise above what I think are the local details and get to the heart of what actually is the problem here or the issue. And we often find once we get to that the other one says, oh yeah, I think we've actually been wrestling with that as well. So I think the power of the peer as an advisor is really impressive to me. I think about this question, Jonathan, from a networking and mentoring perspective, hand in hand, like with a mentee, helping them think about, who's your network? Like you've asked some good questions today that I think I'll bring to my mentoring. Do you have any colleagues that you talk to outside the institution? How could you build those relationships? Where could you find them? People say at our place, UCSF stands for You Can Stay Forever. So we do have a lot of people who've been there a long time, and they might need to be a little more proactive about building a network. And I think that's something that I will try to build into my mentoring meetings with them. And then I would say I've gotten some ideas today about something we're really still working on at our place with our medical school curriculum, which is how to have more input from patients and communities into the curriculum, and how do we go about that? So that's my aspiration from today.
I think both of those concluding comments are a great place to end. Thank you very much, Dr. Hauer. Thank you very much, Dr. Risden. You've given us very nuanced, very complex, but also very meaningful and substantive answers to these really important but thorny questions that I think collectively we're all wrestling with. And before we conclude, I'd also like to give a big thanks to PSI for supporting us with an unrestricted educational grant for the Visiting Scholars Program. And an extra big thank you to Samantha Applewhite, who has been the engine and the organization that's made the multiple moving parts of today possible. And thank you to all of you who have attended. For those of you who are not here, but we're earlier in the day, you don't know that I'm thanking you, but feel it in the karma or in the universe or however that works. And I do hope that we'll have a chance to connect in person right now. And so, Cathy, if you're upstairs, I'll pay for your parking and your elevator ride if you want to come down and join us. We would love to hear from you. You'll see in the chat an opportunity to input some feedback. We really are responsive to it. We have molded and changed our design year on year based on what you tell us is appropriate and desirable. So thanks to all of you. Happy Thursday, and take care.